Jack had been a mailman in the same neighborhood for years. He knew the routes like the back of his hand, and over time he'd become more than just the person delivering letters. He was a familiar face, a friend. Every day he'd wave to the kids, chat with the parents, and offer a smile to the elderly residents who greeted him from their front porches. But there was one stop that always stood out to him: Mrs. Eleanor's house. Mrs. Eleanor was in her 80s and lived alone. Her husband had passed away several years ago, and their children had moved out of state. Despite her age, she always seemed full of life, often inviting Jack in for tea and chatting about old times. But one day, as Jack approached her front door, he noticed something was different. Her clothes were stained, and her usual bright smile seemed forced. She stood by the door, holding onto the frame, as though she needed it to steady herself. The stains on her pants caught Jack's eye. He had seen her in those. She gave him a reassuring smile and nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something Jack couldn't ignore. He had been delivering mail to her for years, and he could tell something was wrong. Jack handed her the mail, his eyes scanning the porch and the entrance. Her home, which used to be neat and well-kept, now appeared cluttered. There were items scattered on the floor, papers piled on the table, and the faint smell of something burning in the kitchen. As he dapat Indian seyon sister seyon, because dukan detestaki dikestays. Mrs. Eleanor, have you had a fall? Jack asked, his voice thick with concern. At first, she waved him off, claiming it was nothing. But then her voice quivered as she confessed that she had slipped earlier in the day, but didn't want to bother anyone. Jack's worry deepened. He glanced around again, noticing the faint stains on the floor, leading from the kitchen to the living room. She'd clearly tried to clean up after herself, but wasn't able to. Something wasn't right. Feeling that something more serious was at play, Jack knew he had to act. He gently asked Mrs. Eleanor if he could help her. She hesitated, but nodded, finally admitting that she felt weak and dizzy. Jack didn't waste any time. He quickly took out his phone and called 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived. They were quick to assess Mrs. Eleanor's condition, checking for injuries, and immediately preparing to transport her to the hospital. But it wasn't just her health that Jack had to worry about. It was what they found next. While the paramedics were attending to her, one of them noticed a faint smell of gas coming from the kitchen. They followed the scent to the source, a leaking gas pipe. It had been slowly leaking for hours, just beneath Mrs. Eleanor's nose. Had Jack not acted when he did, it could have resulted. As the ambulance drove away with Mrs. Eleanor, Jack stood in her. Jack knew he had to ensure that Mrs. Eleanor was safe once she recovered. He called her family, informed them of the situation, and made arrangements for a neighbor to check on her home. In the days that followed, the neighborhood came together to help. They cleaned up, made repairs, and ensured that Mrs. Eleanor would never be alone again. She had no family in town, but she had a community that cared. And thanks to Jack's quick thinking and his compassionate heart, Mrs. Eleanor was not only alive, but safe in her home. Jack continued his route with the same care and attention, but now there was a deeper connection to his community. It wasn't just about delivering mail. It was about looking out for each other, about being there when it mattered most. And for Jack, that was the greatest reward of all. Share your thought in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting stories like this for you, and your support is the one helps me keep going.